in their own countries. They also reflect the diversity of volunteer models, including online, employee, and diaspora volunteering. The global nature of VGA also reflects the universality of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by bringing together members from civil society and the public and private sectors from diverse locations around the world. Last year, we launched our new website, www.volunteergroupsalliance.org, which serves as an information portal for collecting and sharing stories on how volunteers are delivering the SDGs in countries around the world. And to date, we have nearly 150 stories from more than 50 countries, and we welcome each of you to visit the site and to contribute your stories as well. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Emma Morley will be joining us here shortly, and she is the Chief of Volunteer Advisory Services at United Nations Volunteers. So let me now turn it over to Emma.
Thank you, May, and good afternoon and good evening to all our participants in other parts of the world outside New York. And I think it's great that this is a global event. It's really a pleasure to be here today representing the United Nations Volunteers Program in this Volunteer Group Alliance side event to the HLPF on building equal and inclusive societies through volunteering. This focus on building equal and inclusive societies is, I think, highly pertinent to the theme of this year's HLPF, as we reflect how to build back better from COVID-19, including reversing the negative impacts of the pandemic on both the Sustainable Development Goals and how we move countries to help realize the vision of the 2030 Agenda through volunteering. The role of volunteers and volunteering is increasingly recognized by member states as central to making progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. This year, 44 countries are presenting their voluntary national reviews to the high-level political forum. As of yesterday, 35 of these reports were publicly available, and many indeed focus on building back COVID and the role that volunteers have played and will play. 20 out of the 35 reports reported a positive contribution of volunteerism to the Sustainable Development Goals, while 11 of those had a very strong emphasis, and we say they're strongly substantiated the positive contribution of volunteering in their voluntary national reviews. 10 out of the 35 reporting countries which we reviewed reflected volunteering as being integrated into development plans, policies, and strategies. And this is really important in the context of the SDGs as both an integrated mechanism, but also because we know from previous research and evidence that volunteerism is often quite silo-based. So part of our efforts needs to mean that it has to be better integrated into wider development efforts. And finally, 14 out of the 35 reporting countries which we reviewed linked volunteering to inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized groups. So in the face of the multitude of 21st century challenges that we face, the increasing inequalities, climate emergency, and the COVID-19 pandemic, UNV's State of the World report for 2022 presents new evidence on the role of volunteerism as a means of solving global and local development challenges and the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. Indeed, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for a global reset, for a new social contract, for a new era. And building more equal and inclusive societies is central to this endeavor for a new social contract. Let me now put up some slides and focus on some of the key messages of the report, building equal and inclusive societies. So just bear with me while I'll share my screen. So as I said, the 2022 SWVR presents new evidence on the role of volunteerism as a means of solving global and local development challenges, including the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. It's in this context of background of 21st century challenges, increasing inequalities, climate emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the call for a new social contract. Just to give you a bit of background as to, we're going to focus in today on a couple of key elements of the report and on the interaction between government and institutions on volunteers, but I wanted to give you a wider background on this. So some of the key research questions which were addressed in the report is, what is the state of volunteerism in 2021? And this went into some of the facts and figures, some of the gender disaggregations, the split between formal and informal volunteers. What role can volunteerism play in developing more inclusive relationships, collaboration, and partnerships between people and government? And how can these new volunteer state models of collaboration and partnership help deliver sustainable and equitable and inclusive development and the Sustainable Development Goals? Let me go in and focus in on the three models that the report looks at, because I think this will kind of really set the framing today and the foundations for the discussion. So the report came up with three models based on extensive primary and secondary research and case studies. And these models were a deliberative governance model, a model on collaborative service delivery, and a model on social innovation. And these are models of partnership and collaboration between states and volunteers. So the deliberative governance model describes basically forums or spaces where volunteers can participate in dialogues, set strategic priorities, in decision-making processes. It allows volunteers from marginalized groups to have their voices heard and to contribute their expertise and experience to influence and inform government policies and decisions. And this form of volunteering can help, if done well, to ensure representative government, sustainable solutions, and inclusion. And I want to give here one of the examples upon which this research was based for the deliberative governance model. And this is an example from Nepal, which used, and my apologies to all our Nepalese colleagues and volunteers out there if I'm not pronouncing this correctly. It's an example of deliberative governance in the Gurti and Bhakta communities. And what the case study and research showed that local governments interacted with the Gurti and Bhakta in a way of deliberative decision-making. And Gurti and Bhakta are communities, they're traditional social institutions focused on traditions and especially focused on natural resource management. So for the local governments, bringing them in, the volunteers from the Gurti and Bhakta members, enable them to set priorities in community development, to engage in project planning and implementation. And the added value of the Gurtiyas was that they brought in their traditional expertise of resource management, their traditions and culture, and they provided really useful insights for environmental planning, which the local governments admitted that they wouldn't have been able to incorporate or to understand without their participation. And one concrete example of this collaboration through this deliberative governance model was that the Bhakta volunteers partnered with the local government to build a dam, which resulted in the construction of a stronger structure that aligned with both the volunteers' needs and the local government's aspirations. What we saw in all the case studies looking at deliberative governance was that it needed to be done properly. There were issues around voice, agency, representation. Indeed, in this case study from Nepal, there was some constraints and issues around caste and male representation, which were also openly discussed. and the need to make sure that these forums were truly participatory, truly representative, and truly what we call consequential, that they really have outcomes that bring sustainable development results. So that's the first model on deliberative governance. The second model, which is probably the model which probably I would say volunteers are most known for. And indeed, if we think back to COVID-19, we saw volunteers in many roles, what we call perhaps kind of substituting sometimes for the delivery of social services when they're not provided. But we wanted to go beyond that, to think about how the state and volunteers can work together rather than a method of substitution. And so this model really highlights how volunteers create, innovate, and collaborate with governments and institutions in the design, implementation, and evaluation of public programs and services, ensuring they're inclusive and aligned to their needs. And we found that volunteers act as information brokers and mediators, and that their leadership, knowledge, and expertise is recognized. Volunteers are quite often the people on the ground having the first-hand knowledge of what is working, what's not working, how does the service need to evolve. And by working together to achieve beneficial results, the model assists in creating trust and accountability between marginalized groups and the government. I want to give an example here from, which was used in the report around the COVID-19 pandemic, and an example from Lebanon. And in Lebanon, the AMEL Association focused on a partnership between community-based volunteers and state authorities on the co-production of services for domestic migrant workers. And these are a group of workers who were excluded from, at that time, accessing a lot of services, including services related to COVID-19 and vaccination. And what we saw was that the AMAL Association volunteers played an important role, from consultative collaborations to the active co-creation of agendas and services for this group. That migrant workers were often reluctant to approach state authorities because they were fearful of detention or deportation. And by helping them to navigate state processes under the leadership and guidance of the AMAL Association, youth volunteers were able to help restore migrants' trust and link them to the services that they needed. A more concrete, tangible outcome of this collaboration on services was that the Lebanese Ministry of Health actually included migrant workers in their vaccination project. At the beginning, they were excluded, but it was brought to their attention this was a group which was excluded, and they worked together to overcome some of those difficulties to ensure that migrant workers were able to access vaccines. And finally, let me touch on the model of volunteerism as a driver of social innovation. And in this model, we saw that volunteers can be a driver of social innovation, and that often also in the context of the pandemic, volunteers were at the forefront of developing and implementing new solutions to some of the challenges which came up on a day-to-day basis. And innovative platforms and technology promoted by volunteers can enhance government's understanding of marginalized communities, their challenges and concerns. And through developing and working together on these innovative approaches, volunteers can facilitate new ways of working, they can help build networks, and most importantly, they can help rebalance unequal power relationships. And here, I think the role of technology, the role of information, the role of creativity is key. Let me use an example from Malawi to explain a bit this model. So in Malawi, the Art and Global Health Center, otherwise known as ArtGlo volunteers, collaborate with state authorities and communities to ensure equitable health and care delivery. And what they do is that they use participatory art as a tool for social change. And they create an environment in which local community members are supported to build their leadership skills through art and creative processes, while actively influencing health delivery services. And so one of the outcomes was that ArtGlow volunteers work with communities to develop project proposals in areas ranging from sexual and reproductive health to education and creative arts, for example, a project on youth mental health. And they mobilized funds to ensure that activities could be implemented. And they worked with local government officials and offices to help them serve as their partners. So again, a model of collaboration, perhaps a kind of different model. We have other examples in the report around urban planning and information and using special kind of technology. But I personally kind of like this one because it's a bit different. So the use of art and creativity for social innovation. Let me just finish off by quickly going through some of the main messages which we saw across the case studies. And these are very high level, but I think they serve as a great starting point for the discussion we're going to have today. And I think the key messages on what is the role and how do volunteers build equal and inclusive societies. And the first one is that volunteers are bridge builders, they're connectors, they're brokers. They understand the communities and their needs, and they can mediate between state partners and service users. Secondly, volunteering helps people to shape the policies that affect them, to identify their priorities and make sure they're relevant to their needs and aspirations. Volunteering opens up different ways for people to participate in civic affairs. At the end of the day, they focus on issues of concern to them. And this creates some of the change that we need for the sustainable development goals to make sure that the people engagement, the stakeholder engagement there, that the priorities of the people are actually addressed. And finally, volunteers have these skills to help innovate and create results that meet the needs of communities as defined by the communities and not by others. And we also have some recommendations for policymakers, and I think it's great for that this is the HLPF, because this is the forum where as volunteers and volunteer groups, we engage with member states to discuss these issues, and we have 4 kind of main recommendations. And the first is that we need to identify the barriers to volunteering that marginalized people face. We need to create access and make sure that disadvantaged groups are deliberately included. And as I said, we found this in some of the models that we were looking at, issues around gender, issues around caste, issues around marginalization of certain groups, issues related to power structures, and really kind of breaking down some of those barriers is pivotal to maximize and galvanize the strength and energy of volunteers. To be aware of the different ways that men and women volunteer and the levels of access they have, and to not reinforce harmful gender norms and inequalities. To use the expertise of your volunteers. And I think this is a recurrent theme that came up through the case studies, the recognition of really the depth of knowledge, expertise, both in terms of technical subject matter expertise, but expertise and knowledge of the local community, how both process-wise and what the community needs. So using the expertise of your volunteers, expertise and knowledge to support and drive development. And finally, I think a perpetual challenge for the volunteering community is that everyone likes volunteering, they think it's great. But we're always challenged to try and understand and measure the contribution of volunteering to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think we've come far, but so much of the volunteering that goes on throughout the world is informal volunteering, and we need to continuously invest in understanding and measuring volunteering. So that's all from me. I'd like to thank you for listening, and back to May. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. A lot of information packed into those few slides, lots of requests. We will share the slides with everyone. There's going to be others that will be shared throughout our time together, but really appreciate all the information that you provided. I have questions. I'm anxious to get to that portion of our agenda today as well. Next, I'm thrilled to invite Nene Fatoumata Tall, who is the Minister of Youth from the government of Senegal. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be with us in real time, but was gracious enough to prepare a video for us to watch. So we're going to get that queued up and hear from the Minister of Youth from Senegal.
Mesdames, Messieurs, chers participants à cet événement parallèle, en liminaire à mon propos, je voudrais très chaleureusement féliciter les organisateurs de cette conférence que Volontaire Groupe Alliance et le Programme des volontaires des Nations Unies ont bien voulu tenir en marge du Forum politique de haut niveau 2022. Mesdames, Messieurs, distingués participants, le Sénégal est très honoré, comme il l'avait fait en 2018, de présenter sa seconde revue nationale volontaire sur la mise en œuvre des ODD au moment où s'ouvre le Forum politique de haut niveau 2022. Chez nous, au Sénégal, la mise en œuvre des ODD avance de façon satisfaisante, malgré la situation sanitaire liée à la COVID-19, et cela réjouit beaucoup le gouvernement. Certes, la pandémie a mis à rude épreuve la dynamique de mise en œuvre des ODD, mais la fragilisation des secteurs qui en a résulté a revigorer nos capacités de résilience face à cette crise sanitaire qui nous a fait comprendre que nous devons redoubler d'efforts pour l'atteinte des ODD en 2030. Dans sa vision pour un Sénégal émergent à l'horizon 2035, le président de la République, son Excellence M. Macky Sall, a très tôt compris la nécessité de faire appel à toutes les différentes couches de la société. C'est ainsi que dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre du plan Sénégal émergent priorité jeunesse, la promotion et le développement du volontariat ont été reconnus comme une exigence de l'heure à la base d'importantes mesures prises par le président de la République notamment. La promulgation de la loi d'orientation 2021-30 du 7 juillet 2021 relative au volontariat. Une loi venue à son heure qui fixe le cadre juridique permettant de créer un environnement favorable à la promotion et au développement du volontariat. La reconnaissance du volontariat par différents départements ministériels comme un outil prioritaire de mobilisation des jeunes, femmes, personnes du troisième âge, handicapés et autres couches de la société. Le recrutement massif à partir du mois de juin 2021 dans le cadre du programme d'urgence pour l'emploi et l'insertion socio-économique des jeunes, xëyu ndaw ñi, 1000 volontaires du service civique national, 500 animateurs socio-éducatifs, 7000 auxiliaires de reforestation de la Grande Muraille Verte, 2000 auxiliaires des eaux et forêts, 12 000 volontaires pour le ministère en charge du cadre de vie. Le président Macky Sall nous a autorisé ce recrutement massif car il est convaincu que la finalité du volontariat est de contribuer au développement durable dans toutes ses dimensions. Comme nous le savons tous, le volontariat vise à promouvoir la cohésion nationale, l'inclusion sociale et l'amélioration des conditions de vie des populations. Il permet de renforcer les valeurs civiques et patriotiques. Il favorise la solidarité intergénérationnelle, développe les compétences, améliore l'employabilité et l'adaptabilité, contribue à la solidarité entre les peuples et promeut les droits humains, la culture de la paix, le don de soi et la bonne gouvernance. C'est pourquoi je ne voudrais pas conclure mon propos sans marquer l'importance que j'accorde dans le cadre de l'ODD 17 à la mobilisation des groupes de volontaires nationaux et internationaux qui permet de renforcer le partenariat mondial pour le développement durable. Cette mobilisation est reconnue comme un levier d'atteinte et même un moyen puissant et transversal de la mise en œuvre des ODD à travers leur capacité de mobilisation des individus à l'échelle nationale pour contribuer à mettre en œuvre les politiques de développement. C'est d'ailleurs dans cet objectif de partenariat mondial qu'un accord cadre a été signé en octobre 2021 entre mon ministère et France Volontaire, marquant l'engagement des deux parties à favoriser et développer le volontariat en Afrique de l'Ouest et à l'international. La mise en pratique des différents objectifs visés par le volontariat nous promet un monde meilleur où nos populations peuvent vivre en harmonie et dans la paix sans que personne ne soit laissé de côté. Je sais qu'en tant qu'acteur de la promotion et du développement du volontariat, nous ne ménagerons aucun effort pour que ce monde soit. Je réitère mes remerciements aux organisateurs de la conférence et renouvelle mes salutations chaleureuses à toutes et à tous les participants.
Well, our deep appreciation again to Mrs. Nene Fatoumata Tal, the youth minister from Senegal, bringing that very informative piece of the things that are happening, the requirements, the law that was passed, the way that both parties are embracing the way volunteerism can be an antidote to many of the issues being faced, not only in local community, but regionally, nationally, internationally as well. So a deep appreciation for that. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our third speaker. And this is Joy Karim Masache. And she is from the National Planning Commission and Government of Malawi. So let me turn it over to Joy.
Thank you so much. So I'll take you through the presentation for the Malawi as a case study. Next slide, please. So I'll basically introduce what the VNR has meant for us and how we have involved volunteers in the process. I'll then talk about how volunteerism is going beyond the process of implementing the VNR, and lastly, look at the value that we are getting from volunteerism. So as a country, we have developed a long plan, which we're calling the Malawi 2063. And basically this plan is to ensure that Malawi is transformed into a wealthy, self-reliant, industrialized, middle-income country. And to basically operationalize this long-term plan, what we did was to develop a 10-year implementation plan. So that brings us to why we have done a VNR for the country this time around. So as a country, we are second timer in terms of producing the voluntary national reviews. And we have done this because one of the key milestones within our medium-term implementation plan is to achieve most of the SDGs by the year 2030. So the VNR provides us with an opportunity to assess and reflect on the key actions that are expected to be taken for us to be able to achieve this particular milestone. Next. Coming to how we have involved volunteers in the VNR process. So volunteers have really been key in terms of producing our national voluntary review, starting from the technical support. So we had volunteers which were a part of the core technical committee through the UN volunteers as well as VSO, which played very key roles in terms of technical support. They were also part of being part of the technical committee. They got to also be part of the reviewers of the TORs that were constituted for the different structures in terms of implementing the voluntary national review. So the implementation structures, they were part of reviewing those TORs. Together with the volunteers, we were able to develop and review the tools that we used within the VNR process. And also they came in handy in terms of data collection, which includes consultations. And with this, we even had volunteers from the community level, which assist, so these were mainly the youth. And basically they assisted in terms of conducting consultations that also had to do with the youth. So they really came in handy. And through the National Core Technical Committee, again, volunteers from the two agencies that I've mentioned were part of the drafting of the report itself. And you will attest, if you see the report, that it came out really good. And partly this is due to the contribution of the volunteers that participated in the process. So through VSO, we also got to receive financial support that helped in terms of developing the report through consultations, and those were mainly for the youth. So beyond VNR, I mean, VNR is a review that is done, something that is done once in a time. So this particular one has been done in 2022, but then we get to ask ourselves, what then? And I think this is also something that volunteerism is coming in to say beyond VNR, there is SDG implementation. So volunteers are also key in terms of the development of the national plans in line with the SDG from the global frameworks, including the SDGs. So as I indicated, the plan that we are currently using, which is the Malawi 2063 and its first 10-year implementation plan, was also done with the support of volunteers contributing towards the technical aspects of it. And this isn't the first time. The development of the previous plans has also been with the contribution of the volunteers. Implementation of the SDGs themselves, tracking the SDGs. So this is done through the structures that volunteers are able to go through. So usually volunteers, UN volunteers, as well as from VSOs, are placed in government ministries, departments, and agencies where they're able to provide technical support as the line ministries or the agencies are implementing the SDGs, as again, they're able to track the SDGs. And also through their support under specific programs and projects, be it within their different agencies, as well as other non-governmental agencies. So this is how volunteerism has supported towards the general context of implementing as well as tracking of the SDGs. Next slide, please. So looking at the value that this has had in terms of the development setup, we're looking at the provision of technical expertise, because these volunteers have got technical expertise from different areas, which they are able to sort of enhance the different aspects of operations of government as well as their agencies. So enhancing human capacity due to the COVID-19, as well as other emerging issues such as the wars and the pressures that it has brought. There's been a high vacancy rate due to austerity measures as a country has taken to make sure that resources the use of resources is maximized. And the volunteers have come in handy, because in this situation, then they get to beef up the human capacity in a scenario where we do not have a lot of technical expertise to fill in the vacancies within the government. They've been able to cushion in terms of emergencies. So they've come in handy to provide humanitarian work where we've had emergencies such as cyclones that we recently got to experience. So we're looking at this as a win-win situation. So as much as we're getting expertise from volunteerism, we're also, as government public institutions, able to impart some knowledge to the volunteers. So I think this is also a plus that the whole setup has brought in terms of making sure that the development arena is enhanced. And lastly, we're looking at volunteerism as having to build strong partnership, which is making the country able to enhance synergies between the different participating agencies. So to make sure that we deepen impact as well as reduce duplication. So this has also helped a lot to strengthen the partnerships. So broadly, I would speak about the value that volunteerism has had in the general implementation aspect of the SDGs as well as the development plans. Yeah, so basically this is what I can say about the case of Malawi and how we've been interacting with volunteers so far in terms of development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. A lot of information there. I loved that you're a second timer. I think that's a fun description of having done the VNR again, and more engagement of volunteers, not just in the process, but how you're looking beyond that and implementing and incorporating volunteering across departments and just in a variety of different pieces. And it ties back beautifully, to what Emma was talking about as well around measurement and all. So I truly appreciate that. We're going to shift gears now a little bit, and we'll be hearing from some volunteers that have been working in the field, and we'll be opening it up to all of you. So I hope you have some questions as well. And to moderate and facilitate this next part of our conversation, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David Stiers, also with the Volunteer Groups Alliance. And he'll be facilitating this next portion of our conversation today. So David?
Excuse me. There. Thank you so much, May. It's such a privilege to be with you today and to have all of you joining us. Again, as May said, my name is David Stiers. I'm the coordinator of the Volunteer Groups Alliance, and I've had the pleasure of being involved for over 3 years now in this position and working with so many of our wonderful member organizations and volunteers across the globe. I particularly want to thank UN Volunteers, France Volontaire, and VSO for their active involvement in helping plan and produce and bring speakers to today's presentation. And as May said, we would like to hear from all of you, and particularly your experience as volunteers. But I'd like to first invite to our gathering a volunteer that has come to us from France Volontaire. And so I would like to introduce Carolina Baca from the Enlazando project, and she is from Bolivia. And I know that she has been very involved in her work in Latin America. And at 27 years old, she has accomplished so much as a chemical engineer and a law student, an environmental and human rights activist, and the founder of the Young Council for Mother Earth Bolivia. And again, with the Enlazando project, which is financed by the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs and implemented by France Volunteers. She's been an active volunteer, and this project takes place in 5 Latin American countries: in Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. And it aims to bring together and structure volunteer organizations and organizations working for civic engagement, and by contributing to the creation of national and regional networks, and by promoting the exchange of good practices and disseminating values specific to volunteering. And it also wishes to engage bi and multilateral cooperation between the 5 countries, and as part of a regional and international approach, especially with France. And so again, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Carolina. And I have 2 specific questions for you. The first, can you tell us about your mission as a volunteer and the achievements you have made?
Hi, thanks for the question. Good afternoon. I hope everybody is doing well. My name is Carolina Vaca, and I am from the south of Bolivia. Last year, I had the pleasure to be an international solidarity volunteer of France Volunteer in Ecuador when they were executing the Enlazando project in Latin America. My mission as a volunteer was to support the strengthening, the development, and the facilitation of the Ecuadorian Volunteer Network, which is a platform of representative organizations of Ecuadorian volunteering. Among them, we can find UNV Ecuador, Ecuadorian Red Cross, the Scouts, and precisely during my mission, France Volunteer Ecuador occupied the general coordination of this network. So I work with them. About my achievements during this mission, I believe they were closely related to the evolution of this network because I was able to contribute to each of its lines of action, such as in the institutional framework, for the inclusion of new members. In the social incidents, I organized various activities for the International Volunteer Day. In political advocacy, supporting the process of construction of the volunteer law proposal for the Ecuador, and in the generation of the knowledge, carrying out the first cycle of workshops on volunteering, which for me was an important highlight since it focuses on volunteer managers who participate from all the states of the country. Even I was able to learn more about the culture of volunteering and how it should be strengthened through the generation of skills, abilities, and especially the alliance with all the sectors involved in volunteering. So that lead us to guarantee adequate forms of volunteering. In other words, I consider that I learned and grew up a lot during this mission, and now I can also contribute to the development of my country, Bolivia. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and it's wonderful with your story talking about not only the contributions that you made to the community in Ecuador through your volunteer work, but also the impact that your volunteer work had on you as an individual. A final question for you. What are your key messages that you would like to share with governments about how volunteering can be successfully incorporated into national plans and strategies?
Okay, I believe that in order the governments to successfully incorporate volunteering strategies, they must first open their mentality towards a broader vision of volunteering. Understand that volunteering can have different ages, false experience, abilities, and especially that we can be very important for the development of our countries and the social transformation, just if we have the right conditions. I think this will be an achievement for this training of the culture of volunteering, together with the actors and potential actors of volunteering, such as social groups, the state, companies, not-profit organizations, academia, and international cooperation. Together when they generate training process for managers and volunteers that are recognized by the academy, that give them extra points in their formal education, because we know that volunteers can have extensive experience through the not formal learning, and initiative through integral training will be very important. On the other hand, from my experience with the Ecuadorian Volunteer Network, I also consider it very important that the public policies and regulation created for the promotion of volunteering respond to the needs and expectations of the volunteers, and that is clear that the rights and duties that we have, and furthermore, that they invest and finance the necessary resources. And I mention again that we volunteers being seen as actors in development and transformation of our societies. That would be all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to listen to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alina, for your very impassioned suggestions about how, you know, volunteering is not free, but the power of volunteering can be unlocked when governments invest the resources to really adequately support the role of volunteers and what they can do to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And during our first half of our program, we've had the opportunity to hear some wonderful case studies specified in the research from UNV around Nepal and Lebanon, and to hear stories from Senegal and Malawi and from South America. And we would love to hear from you. And so if you have particular questions for any of our panelists, if you have your own story that you would like to share, your own experience, feel free to hit the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hands. I'd be delighted to call upon you. And you can simply unmute yourself and please ask your question or share your story. And we look forward to an engaging dialogue to hear from you and any of the questions that our speakers may have engendered in your minds thus far today. Yes, so Sindina, if you would like to unmute and please share your story, ask your question. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It's Sadie now, but you can call me Sadie. I think it's easier like that.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Sadie now Mohamedou Ndiaye. I am from Senegal, and actually, this is too bad. My minister just sent a video because I wanted to have her here because I have question for her because I'm trying to make her like since a full year, but I think it's going to happen in the next couple of days. My first question is literally around the status of volunteering. In my country, one of the observations that I have made is like generally when we talk about volunteering, it's more with the institution like UNV, like Friends Volunteer, and people don't emphasize grassroots local organization, what they are doing because they are literally the volunteers. That's what we call, that's how we call that here. So in my country, we have a bunch of youth-led organizations with several volunteer and several youth volunteer, but there is no status for us, and there is nothing to emphasize generally the work that we literally do as grassroots organization. So this is the kind of question that I have. The story is I am a civic leadership and a civic practitioner. I do a lot of civic engagement, and I think 3 years ago, we start a civic engagement program all around the Senegal to promote volunteering. And at the end, we create an association named Collectif des Volontaires, which is a federation of at least 10 youth-led organizations. And the mission and the ambition is like to be like one of the reference when we talk about volunteering. So we have 100 of volunteers for 3 activities per year. But as I just mentioned, we have big issues when we come to have the status and also for people to emphasize our job, because what we want to do is the people that we train to be the human resource like for grassroots organization, and so they can have like good human resource like for the viability and the sustainability of the organization. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your question, the work that you're doing in Senegal. And not surprisingly, in the volunteer world, we sort of have the formal volunteering through institutions, organizations, which is more easily trackable and to evaluate and find data about. But we know that in communities across the globe, there's a tremendous amount of informal volunteering that unfortunately is not as well known just because it's not as easily tracked, evaluated, and told. So certainly the grassroots volunteering in every community is just important, and maybe even more important, sort of the neighbor to neighbor approach to volunteering than the volunteering through our institutions, although we know our communities rely on our institutions, organizations very much. I'd love for anyone else who would like to address that question. And I also would welcome anyone else who would like to raise their hands for any other comments. Okay, Amal?
Yes, thank you. So this is Amali Mem. I'm the Regional Youth and Volunteering Development Coordinator of I4C, International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies in MENA region. And I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. Also be glad to be part of the experts group who worked on the state report for 2022. And it was great also listening to Emma, giving the journey through the report. And one thing that I want to highlight in this is actually, when you ask any of the governments, do you value the work that volunteers are doing? They will definitely say yes. And we have listened from decision makers from Malawi and from Senegal, and everyone was really emphasizing on this fact. However, what we need to hear from decision makers is what they really do in order to enable the platform for volunteers to do more. And as representative for Red Cross Red Crescent, what we are usually keen to listen and to have is having the social, I would say, safety net for volunteers to give, especially if we are really focusing on the grassroots volunteering and community-based volunteers, especially during times where volunteers would be the frontliners, and we have seen during the pandemics and in many disasters, how our volunteers are really the first responders. It's very important that we are also at the same time, while we are promoting for volunteering, that we are enabling the environments, especially the safe environment for volunteers to give back. So this is my insight on this one. And I think what we can do also when it comes to people who are working on volunteering development, it's good that we have looked on the social contract between governments or states and the volunteers. But maybe what we can work on is to develop standards for what can really governments do beyond the laws, strategies, and policies. Something that standards for volunteering development at the national scale. And we can start looking at case studies from different countries on what they are doing in order to reach these standards. Something like ISO. If you're asking any of the companies, are you meeting the ISO standards? They will say yes and no based on the standards. If I'm asking governments what you're doing, or organizations even who are mobilizing volunteers, what you're doing in order to ensure that you are meeting the standards for volunteers, they will say, where are the standards? So just these are the thoughts and reflections. And I'm really glad once more to be with you at this night. It's already 8 at Egypt now, at Cairo time. Thank you, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amal, for being with us and for those wonderful comments about understanding that volunteers are often the safety net in many communities, but also need a safe environment to work in themselves, and the idea of an enabling environment for volunteering, because we know that the volunteers are more effective when they are given the resources, the tools, the safe environment to be productive. And the standards are something that the Forum for International Volunteers and Development has been working on for several years. I see James O'Brien is on the call, and if you're available, James, to maybe talk a little bit about the standards that Forum has put together and the ability to potentially help those governments and organizations with their standards. But I also see Samuel Therese on the call from Sierra Leone. And so I will call on you next, Samuel, and look forward to hearing from you. So thanks for being with us, Samuel.
Hi, David, thanks. Hello, everyone. Yes, I just want to speak for my colleagues in Senegal. We are actually stopped by, and also perhaps talk about how we have been able to push forward an agenda with the government to have a buy-in in terms of like incorporating volunteers engagement or integrating volunteering into national plans. And, you know, like from when we started like engaging with them in the beginning, seems like it's never gonna possible and never gonna talk about policy with government and looking at volunteering from the perspective where we see the big players like VSO and UNV, and then you have the Red Cross at national level. We are actually been doing a lot of work at the country alone. So when you talk about bringing the VIOS network and putting the local organization in front, it was like a dead idea, like it's not going to work. All we see in the bigger picture is this bigger ones going there. So what I'm trying to say is that we actually like looking at how then do we change the conversation from looking at should we always go with the big players other than like the sustainability aspect of it, the decolonizing aspect of it, to say, can we position and empower the smaller players to lead the national organizations who are in the countries to be able to lead those conversations? So when these organizations, the bigger one, are not around, we're looking about the sustainability pathway of it. So when what we understand here is that, yes, organizations like VSO played an amazing role in terms of creating the platform. ActionAid play an amazing role in terms of creating the platform. But when it comes to the policy development, they are looking for concrete issues like my colleague from the MENA region was talking about social safety net for volunteering. We realize that the government is being too reluctant to be able to address those issues because they found not enough evidence. But with the state of the World Volunteer Report, we're able to like provide a lot of evidences coming forward. So there are a lot of ways we feel that that is hindering some of the problem. And I feel that we need to be able to look at organizations on the ground working. They must be able to look at working with local organizations to strengthen local organization at national level, giving them the capacity so that they carry on conversation with their national governments. And then we'll be talking about the sustainability pathway of it. Then we're talking about strengthening volunteering at national level. And by so doing, we were talking about institutionalizing volunteering. So it's cut across in the bigger picture. Now we are addressing policy. Now we are looking at developing the first policy for Sierra Leone, because we see our volunteers were able to articulate. Our volunteers then support the national development plan for the country. And now the volunteers also support the implementation of the sustainable development goals with evidences. And now the government is calling at the moment, calling on volunteers, supporting volunteers to go around and looking at financing framework for the SDGs. So this is how far we've actually been able to come from. But I feel that one thing that I learned is the fact that we need to empower national organization. We need to like walk through them to the government, so we institute a kind of localization or decolonizing the structures of how we've been working with volunteers, so that we don't overshadow the local organizations because they don't have the resources, but they have the willingness. There's a lot of volunteer work going on. So that's one of the things that I think is necessary for us to lead. Yes, if I'm going to say something, like we need to look at really go back and deconstruct and support local organizations, whereas we work through them to implement and to position them to carry on the work in the lasting way where we cannot exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And again, many of us represent national and international organizations, but at the end of the day, we know that all volunteering is local. And so thank you for talking about how to make that connection between localizing our work and giving the support to those local volunteers and the necessary government policies and support that's needed as well. So I'm going to turn it over to James O'Brien, Executive Director of Forum, for the international involvement of volunteers in development, to talk more about, again, the standards that Forum has been promoting for the past couple of years, and their upcoming international volunteer cooperative organizations conference, IVCO, coming up in Sali, Senegal, in just a few months. So over to you, James.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to speak, but my ears pricked up when I heard mention of standards. I'm very grateful that you called on me. So we had very similar conversations amongst Forum, who are the International Forum for Volunteering in Development. And about 5 years ago, we were sort of looking around saying lots of organizations have standards around volunteering, and within some countries there are standards, but there was no globally universally agreed set of standards around volunteering and development. So we set out to create that set of standards, which we launched at our conference in Kigali in 2019, and then piloted, reviewed, and relaunched last year at an online conference. And it's called the Global Volunteering Standard. It's for organizations that work with volunteers to achieve their mission. And that includes government agencies that work with volunteers. And it covers the entire program cycle for volunteering. So it goes from designing and developing programs through duty of care, volunteer management, and on to measuring impact. And it also covers the entire volunteer journey. So the entire journey that a volunteer goes on in engaging with an organization and giving their time freely. Along with the standard, we've also created an online platform so organizations can do an interactive self-assessment of their own practice against the standard. And we're beginning to provide more hands-on support to any organization who's interested in engaging with the standard. So starting in November, we'll be starting a 10-week course or program with organizations where we'll go through explaining what the standard is and what it's about and how it's relevant to your organization, doing the self-assessment, seeing where you stand against the standard, and then doing some action planning for your organization around what changes might be made on the back of assessing your performance against the standard. So our intention is to do the first one in November. It's open to any organization, whether or not you're a member of our network, and then to deliver that course twice a year going forward. As David said, we also have a conference coming up, so I'm not here to plug the conference, but the IFCO, the International Volunteer Cooperation Organizations Conference in Sali, Senegal, from the 16th to the 19th of October. And at that conference, we'll also have a session looking at our standard in context. So looking also at the African Union Continental Volunteering Standard, standards that exist within organizations and countries and how it all fits together, and seeing how better standards for volunteering can help to achieve the SDGs. So that's probably enough time. I put a link in the chat. I'm always happy to talk to people about the standard. So if people want to get in contact with me, I'm very happy to do that. And thanks for the opportunity to say a few words about it.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And again, in the chat, you'll see the Global Volunteering Standards at standard.forum-ids.org. And so, and as May said, the standards are in Spanish, French, and English on the site. And I know additional language translations are forthcoming. Other questions that anyone has, other stories, comments that you would like to share, or questions for any of our speakers that we've heard from thus far today? Again, so much appreciate everyone sharing and the opportunity to bring us together globally in this online event today. The other thing I will share is that we are part of, as we mentioned, the high-level political forum that kicked off at the UN headquarters with an opening session in the General Assembly this morning. The program is available to be seen online on UN Web TV for anyone who cannot be in New York City this week and next. 44 voluntary national reviews, as we mentioned, will be presented next week, as well as this week reviews of several of the SDGs. And the Volunteer Groups Alliance is the operating partner for the Volunteers Stakeholder Group at the UN, which is one of 21 major groups and other stakeholders, which represent civil society and business, or the non-governmental part of the voice at the United Nations, so that our member states and our governments can hear from our perspectives. And two aspects of the high-level political forum, which has been happening since, I believe, 2015, is that each of the major groups and other stakeholders, which we are part of, can hold a side event, which we are doing here online again this year. Maybe next year in 2023, we can be in person again in New York City, as we were in 2019. But it's been wonderful to engage people in 2020, 2021, and this year through having these online side events. And we also have the opportunity to nominate individuals to serve as lead discussants and again, stakeholder experts to provide their voice during the deliberations. And of the 21 major groups and other stakeholders, not every group may get an opportunity to have a slot, but I'm very pleased that the Volunteer Stakeholder Group was selected this year with Wezi Chimwala from Malawi, who represents VSO in that country as our speaker, and she will be speaking this afternoon at 5:30 New York time on, again, the UN Web TV about the SDG 17 around partnerships, as well as next Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. New York time for the official major groups and other stakeholders session. So thank you, Wesley, for being in New York City and representing our volunteers' voice there this week and next. May, I'll call on you next.
Thanks, David. Oops, I'm having trouble here doing that. I had a question maybe for Joy, but maybe it's for others as well. And it really came out, I think someone made the comment, of not being able to connect with some of the government folks to develop a partnership. So I'm curious on what ways have people found it effective to reach out to other organizations or volunteer involving organizations, either in the planning of the VNR or in doing this work. So maybe there are those that people are aware of and already have a relationship, but maybe you're feeling, like you're a smaller organization or you're outside of that group. And are there strategies or things that people have found to be effective so that they can be part of the VNR process or to get their voice and their ideas incorporated into the planning that takes place?
Thank you so much. Maybe I can start and then others can chip in. So for Malawi, basically what we've done is to sort of open up to ideas in terms of the planning processes, as well as we were developing the VNR. So what we basically did at the very first stage in terms of the VNR was to have a launch which was presided over by the Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs. And we did our best to sort of publicize, to say we are producing a VNR and would like to call for support. However, that support could be technical and basically just participation. We also got to indicate the different roles that the different players would play within the processes of developing the VNR. And once that was done, there was a channel through which they could send emails or requests to say this is a role that we would like to play in terms of the development of the VNR, and someone was constantly there to manage it and sort of see through that whatever requests that we are being provided with or whatever support is able to be put in place and basically just to implement. We've also adopted the same in terms of the development strategies, so bottom-up approach, where we basically just get contribution from the different stakeholders, including volunteers. And again, I should indicate that it is indeed important in terms of grassroots volunteerism, but also just to appreciate the VIOs in terms of being that bridge to sort of link the public institutions to the volunteers. So basically that's what I can say in terms of how we've been able to open up to volunteerism.
Any other questions or comments that anyone has? Yeah, Tapiva.
Thanks, David. I just wanted to add on to what Joy has said. The major challenge that comes through with regards to the involvement of the volunteer constituency in the VNR process is the coordination who takes lead. When the process is initiated, sometimes it's very difficult to put together the volunteer organizations and then they organize themselves into how they want to put together and interface with the government entity responsible for putting together the report. This is quite critical because in most cases, if there's no link, particularly through the coordinating ministry or the entry, the government entity for volunteering, it becomes a nightmare to get involved or for the contributions of volunteers to be recognized. So what has happened in other countries, for example, I can give you the case of Kenya. They have a very strong ministry that is the focal point for volunteering. As soon as the government is volunteered to participate, then they call upon the volunteer sector to come together and then put together their contribution in the form of an analysis, which SDGs, for example, if, for example, that particular VNR cycle is looking at 4 or 5 foreign SDGs, then focus on that and then facilitate the interface with sometimes the consultant writer is very important. These are processes, but they are very, very critical, or through the ministry coordinating the VNR process. It is the coordination, my emphasis, that is very critical for the volunteer constituents to come together, organize themselves, and then have a direct link with the ministry coordinating the writing of the report, as well as the writers themselves. I recall that at some point I've had to talk to the writers themselves because some of them, they don't sometimes understand or their appreciation of volunteer contributions to the SDGs probably may not be available, may not be there. So one has to create that awareness. One is to sensitize and submit something through a proper analysis of the contribution of volunteer efforts in the various areas of the SDGs. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Abiba. Any other comments or questions? Because I'd like to turn it back over to Emma for any final words or thoughts she has based on the conversation we've heard today.
Thanks, David. No, perhaps I could just finish off by I think linking some of the questions and some of the reflections that we've heard about today. I think firstly, the colleague Sedina from Senegal, I think this is one of the most important kind of questions that we face as a volunteering community. We know that most volunteering across the world takes place through informal volunteering, not formal volunteering in organizations. But at the same time, informal volunteering brings with it what I would say special characteristics, special spirit. And that is something which I think is pivotal for development, is pivotal for societal cohesion, is pivotal for societies across the world. And one of the challenges we face is how do we better recognize and measure this informal volunteerism and how it contributes without making it formalized? Because the minute we make it formalized, we're going to lose and dilute some of those really unique trends and positive characteristics that informal volunteering brings. And as I said, most of the world's volunteering is informal volunteering. So I just want to kind of leave that first thought out. The second thought I wanted to reflect on was the issue around, let me call it power structures. And at the heart of collaboration between state and volunteers groups is issues around power, yeah? Issues around access to decision-making, issues to who takes decision, how you collaborate. And what we try to do in this report is get to the bottom of that and try and find positive models of how that collaboration worked. But it was also very, very difficult to find a perfect model which didn't have issues of representation, didn't have issues where certain groups were excluded, or where conversations were perhaps moderated in a way which didn't take in consideration power structures. So I think to me, one of the big reflections is we know that volunteers can be agents of change, yeah? And how do we ensure that volunteers as well as state institutions become agents of change? And I think, as Amal said, it's like we need change on both sides to reflect really the reality of this world that we face, which is unequal and is also in a way becoming more equal and more unequal and more fragmented. And perhaps the third reflection I want to share is really, I really appreciated the reflections from Joy about the VNR process. And as we're moving now towards many countries doing second, third generation VNRs, if you talk to our colleagues from UNDESA, they say the number one thing that we really need to kind of improve on now is stakeholder participation. How do we get better participation? So I just want to leave with the thought that the opening is there. It's to recognize that there needs to be more wider stakeholder participation, more participation of volunteers. We know that the power structures and the way of collaboration need improving. But I think through discussions such as this, we make 1-2 steps forward. And I just wanted to thank everyone for listening and for participating today. Over to you, May.
Thanks very much, Emma. Again, a thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for participating today. I'm really struck by, I guess it came out in several ways, but for me, you know, sort of this recommendation that Emma shared at the beginning around valuing and recognizing and acknowledging the expertise that volunteers bring, that I think in our haste to meet deadlines, to move things forward, you know, we sort of are asking folks to do specific things or engaging with us in a certain role. And it does take more effort, you know, to see, are there ways that they might have a perspective that could enhance what we do that we may not even be thinking about, but it adds time, it adds a layer of complexity. And I think we find ourselves impatient sometimes to do that. So I think that is a great challenge and recommendation for how we think about doing that and engaging folks and increasing stakeholder participation, as Emma has just said as well. I really think the models that were shared that come out of the State of the World Volunteering Report were really good for all of us to think about as we think about partnerships and as we reflect on, you know, are there ways, is this really about being more inclusive and having people understand, you know, the role? Is this about innovating a solution and why we're engaging folks, but seeing, you know, how we ourselves are doing partnership and working with others, and appreciated hearing, you know, from the ministry's perspective in Senegal, but also Joy speaking about, you know, sort of the practical sort of processes that were taking place in Malawi. I just found that to be really, really helpful. And so no one has all the answers, but I hope each of you have felt that you've heard something that's new or something that you might be able to implement as you think about partnerships in our quest to move the SDGs and the results forward. And the ever challenging point around measurement and evaluation and the impact happening. I think that also challenges us, you know, to the informal and formal volunteering. And as David described, it's certainly easier as we've been thinking about it in the formal realm, but with so many people engaged informally, you know, as a neighbor, as, you know, someone who's just helping out, you know, or however, you know, they're seeing that role, I think has to be measured as well. And so we're all challenged to think about that as well. But so appreciate everyone's time and their information. I hope you'll have an opportunity to participate in some of the other activities with this year's HLPF. But on behalf of the Volunteer Groups Alliance, I just really appreciate everybody's participation today, especially our speakers who took the time to prepare for this. And my deep thanks to everyone for your engagement today. Enjoy the rest of the HLPF, and we'll hope that you'll stay in touch with us. Thanks.
Thank you.